And so welcome everybody to New Mexico Solar Energy Association's monthly webinar, where we try to delve into subjects around solar and energy sovereignty and justice in the transition. And tonight we are very fortunate to have Timothy DenHerder Thomas, who is, oh, I could read the whole thing, but he's from Cooperative Energy Futures, and I'll put that link in the chat so that you'll be able to read more about it in specific. But the critical thing is that Minnesota got their community solar laws passed. When was it, Timothy?
2013.
So they've had a good 8-year start on this, and they have over a gigawatt of community. Did I get that right?
It's just under a gigawatt, but
under a
it's
gigawatt
close.
of community solar throughout the state. So they are a true energy producer in Minnesota. And so when somebody says, oh, it's cloudy and rainy and there's 10,000 lakes, you can tell them that they're slightly south of Germany, which is already 33% solar. So the sun shines everywhere, and if you know how to collect it, you can do very well. So without much further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Timothy DenHerder Thomas.
Thank you. And it's really good to be here virtually with you all. I actually have never been to New Mexico, although I am excited to visit sometime in the next few years. Am actually working with a number of people focused on energy democracy and bringing local clean energy to the community level around the country, including some folks from New Mexico, and just have been hearing a lot of good things about the new community solar law and just the work happening on the ground. As Andrew said, I serve as a general manager for Cooperative Energy Futures. We are a clean energy co-op, so we're a member-owned business. Our focus right now is on community solar, and so we develop community solar gardens for our members, and then we are also owner and operator of those community solar gardens, and we participate with private investors in what's called a tax equity partnership flip to both use the tax credits, then also ensure long-term community ownership and benefit for our members. Andrew was mentioning how rapidly community solar has grown in Minnesota, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. I also want to highlight that as a cooperative community solar developer, we are pretty small in Minnesota's community solar industry. Community solar market, and about 8 or 9% of the residential community solar market in the state. So we bring a very specific angle to this, focused on access and focused on community benefit. We have a very strong focus on ensuring that low-income communities and communities of color here in Minnesota get access and participation in community solar. So I had a little slideshow that I was going to pull up and kind of go through that in maybe 20 minutes or so. Then we'll keep going. I'm just seeing this question. Community solar garden is just the term for a community solar project that's used in Minnesota. It doesn't really have any overlap with agriculture or urban farming, other than actually in some rural areas, people are starting to look at how do you stack functions with beekeeping or sheep grazing or all sorts of other interesting things happening.
That's the way
there.
to do it. Yeah.
But yeah, let me just share my screen quickly and get this going. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Great. So I just wanted to give a little bit of an overview about what has allowed us to do this work in Minnesota. And this may feel very familiar to you all, just on a slightly older timeline. So Minnesota passed a state statute authorizing community solar in May of 2013. There's the statute number in case you want to look it up. It does a few things. It requires Xcel Energy, which is our largest investor-owned utility in the state, to launch a community solar garden program, and it allows other utilities to do so using that same statute. Xcel Energy must interconnect all eligible projects into its grid. So as long as you design the project appropriately and it meets all the technical specifications for interconnection, and there's no voltage or other issues created that can't be remediated in a reasonable way, Xcel has to accept the project. Xcel also has to compensate all participating subscribers at a given rate. Now, this is very significant. Originally, when the law was passed, those rates were based on the applicable retail rate with an incentive for renewable energy credits. So in Minnesota, our residential retail rates are about 13.5 cents. Our commercial retail rates are about 10.5 cents. And the bill credit was actually based on that with a 2 to 3 cent adder for the value of the renewable energy credits. So when we were initially developing projects, those projects were locking in a rate schedule that was around 15.5 cents for residents and around 12.5 cents for larger businesses. However, for projects that were proposed starting in 2017 or later, that rate schedule switched to a method that's called the value of solar. So this is a big complex calculation that's happening in Minnesota where every year the utilities have to run this calculation accounting for all of the ways that solar saves costs to the grid, both fuel costs, avoided power plant costs, avoided transmission costs and associated losses, avoided pollution. You know, there's a whole big long calculation, and we spend, it seems, 6 months of the year, every year, fighting about that calculation in front of the Public Utilities Commission. But basically, once a value of solar is approved for that year, any project that is proposed in that year secures that value of solar, which locks in a 25-year schedule. This is in some ways very valuable because it means that you have rate certainty. You know what compensation your project will get for 25 years. However, the fact that it is a single value has been very difficult for developing projects that are supporting residents. Because whereas earlier we were getting that compensation at 15.5 cents for residents, we don't even need it to be that high. But right now we're getting compensation around 9.4 cents for both residents and commercial. And there's been a whole lot of discussions in Minnesota about residential adders to that. And I can talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But I just wanted to highlight that rate question is key. We also have this law, which I noticed when I was reviewing the New Mexico law, is very similar in your statute, that the program rules must allow for the accessibility and financeability of projects. We think this is really important. We think it's a really good thing that's included in your statute, and we think it's been very helpful for making the case on a variety of changes to the program. Oh, there we go. So the program rules by the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission were finally approved in December of 2014. So we had about an 18-month window where we were hashing out the rules. There have been several subsequent amendments. The first projects in the entire program actually came online in late 2016, and many more in 17, 18, and beyond. This is somewhat old data, but it's the best, most complete data that the Department of Commerce has released. This is a chart showing annual installations of solar in Minnesota in 3 basic categories. Distributed in the dark gray at the bottom is all of the residential and commercial net metered rooftop solar in the state. This yellow section is the community solar garden portion, and then the light gray is utility solar, which, as you can see, goes up and down a lot based on what the regulators require the utilities to build. But we're now at a point where community solar is over half of all the solar installed in Minnesota. And as Andrew said, we're at this point somewhere between 850 megawatts and a gigawatt. It changes all the time. So yeah, it's been a really meteoric rise. At the beginning of 2016, there were a total of 37 megawatts of solar installed in the state. And today, if you count all the different types of solar, there's probably about 11 or 1200 megawatts of solar in the state. So this has been one of the huge factors fueling just explosive growth of clean energy in Minnesota. However, as I alluded to briefly, this program is not necessarily very equitable in terms of who's getting the benefit. Right now, over 85% of that community solar capacity is subscribed by corporate, municipal, or institutional subscribers. Less than 15% is subscribed by residents. And even within that portion that is subscribed by residents, most other developers are using credit scores or other kind of income screening requirements to decide who can be a part of it. From our perspective as a co-op, you know, the people who have the highest energy burdens should really be first in line for these benefits. And it feels to us substantially like the industry has gone where the money is and where it's easy to finance, as opposed to, you know, where the biggest impact or where the biggest benefits are. And we spend a lot of our time right now trying to make legislative and regulatory changes to reshape the program towards that intent. And I will just highlight, and we can talk more about this after I finish, but I will just highlight that that's important not only from a ethics or, you know, principles standpoint, but I think it's really important from a strategic standpoint, because the way in which this program has become you know, very corporate and not very focused on community, has substantially undermined the political and public backing for the program, which has left it exposed to kind of repeated utility attacks over time. And so I think it's really important to think about how the public perception and public impact interplays with the long-term legal and policy protections for the program. Mentioned we're a co-op. We've really come to a place where we're trying to define what we think community and community solar should mean. And we have 4 basic principles. First and foremost is access. We believe as a co-op that the whole community should be able to participate, including renters, low-income households, communities of color. That's a centerpiece of our work. Community creation. So we do as much as we can to ensure that local governments, community-based organizations can work with us, and we encourage other developers to do the same, to really envision and launch projects that benefit their community. It's very easy for this type of program to become kind of like a, you know, big developers are calling the shots about where and who and how, as opposed to the people who are ultimately using the energy. Third, community ownership. So local people who participate in community solar should have control and reap the benefits. We do this via cooperative ownership, which I can talk about a little bit more in a moment. But, you know, however you structure it, and I think there's opportunities for tribally owned projects and indirectly, after you figure out all the tax complexity, nonprofit or public owned projects. There's a lot of different ways that communities can be involved in that ownership process. And then finally is wealth, making sure that the job creation, local business development, and just the profits from projects should equitably benefit people in our community. This is really what we stand for. This is how we believe community solar should be developed. And I'll talk a little bit about some examples of what we've done to try and fulfill those goals. I just wanted to pull this up really briefly. This is a couple years old, but this is just from the Solar Foundation fact sheet. You're probably familiar with this. They do a state-by-state report. But just it has helped document the really explosive growth in jobs and economic opportunity that solar has helped fuel in Minnesota. And you can get similar analyses over time in your state from the Solar Foundation. I'm sure many of you are already aware of this. So I wanted to just start by sharing, this was a launch event for our very first project. This is an event we held on the roof of Shiloh Temple in North Minneapolis. This is a primary African-American church in a low-income community of color. And they were really the first entity that was like, we want to do this cooperative clean energy, put this on our roof. We want the benefit. They actually partnered with a neighboring mosque. So the guy with the mic is the pastor of the church. The guy standing next to him is an imam of the nearby mosque, who partnered together on this project. And collectively, those two places of worship get 30% of the energy credited to their bills, and the other 70% goes to 30 neighborhood residents. We also have here some of the local workers who were hired to install the project. Within this picture are community subscribers, one of the state legislators who helped write the program, city council member and mayor of Minneapolis. It was just a really exciting way to bring people together from a lot of different walks of life around visioning what clean energy can look like. I mentioned the job piece. So as a co-op, we don't actually do installation. We contract with an installer to actually install the system, but we included in our contracts a requirement that installers use at least 50% minority labor. And the installer on this project, IPS, actually kind of went above and beyond that. They created a team that was about 90% minority labor, primarily from the neighborhood through a job training program. And one of these guys who worked on this project actually is also a subscriber to the project, and then recently has run for and is elected to the Cooperative Energy Futures board as a member of the board of directors. So it's just kind of an example of how we're trying to stack those many different layers of benefit and accountability. And again, these folks were initially hired just for these projects, but it's been both with that company as well as other companies in the solar industry, a pathway to long-term employment in solar. I'm just checking the chat briefly if there's a question I need to answer. Great. Let's keep going. Sorry, my mouse is not wanting to advance. That's very odd. Okay. So this is the finished Shiloh Temple Community Solar Project on that same roof. It's a just over 200 kilowatt system. It's one of our smallest systems. You can see downtown Minneapolis in the background. It's roof mounted, as I mentioned. 20% of the energy goes to the church, 10% to a nearby mosque, and then the other 70% is 30 neighborhood residents in the area. We then went into a major expansion phase, planning a total of 8 projects across the central and southern parts of Minnesota, again, all in Xcel territory, mix of rooftops and ground mounts. Some of these, we had community partners that really identified this is where we want this project to go. In others, we had community organizations that wanted to subscribe people, but they were really looking to us to bring people in and site the facility. And so we went out and talked to property owners, again, in the city on rooftops and in rural areas and in ground mounted areas. So this is a photo of our launch event at the City of Edina Public Works Building. This is one of the suburbs just outside of Minneapolis. They issued an RFP and ultimately selected us to host a community solar garden on the roof of their Public Works Building. This was a big kickoff event with the community subscribers in Edina, because as one of the conditions or contingencies for using their roof, they set a requirement that all of the subscribers had to be Edina City residents. And we're actually now working on similar partnerships that are getting even more specific, like we want to make sure this percentage is serving renters or low-income households. This is an example on another church in the city of Eden Prairie, which has actually now initiated a partnership with the city of Eden Prairie that's doing a very similar project with us that's currently in development. Some of our rural sites, you can get a little bit of a sense of what Minnesota looks like in the middle of the winter. This is a farm field in southern Minnesota. This project is 1.3 megawatts DC. We have subscribers who are residents of the Somali community in the nearby town of Faribault. We have residents who are part of a manufactured housing park co-op nearby. We have residents who are tenants in the city of Northfield, local farmers. And it's just, again, really exciting ways to bring a lot of different people in a community together who might not otherwise know each other or see each other. Similar ground-mounted project just outside of St. Cloud. This is early spring. Pretty traditional fixed tilt ground mount project. Again, about 1.3 megawatts, which is the standard size for these kind of not space constrained projects. And then this one was quite an adventure. This is a parking canopy in downtown Minneapolis, which is on a 7-level parking garage, which is operated by the Minnesota Department of owned by the Minnesota Department of Transportation, operated by the city of Minneapolis, and it forms a bridge over an interstate highway, so it's designated as a federal highway bridge. So we basically had to coordinate local, state, and federal jurisdictions to design and build this project, plus the structural steel to form the canopy dramatically increases the cost. So we had to do all sorts of financial gymnastics to pull this together. But again, it's primarily serving residents of North Minneapolis, so a low-income community of color, residents of South Minneapolis, meters in a number of affordable housing projects, really pulling together a bunch of those kind of high-impact subscriber bases. The thing I wanted to emphasize is that all of these projects are cooperatively owned. Some of you are probably very familiar with this, but for anyone who wants a quick overview of what is a co-op and how is it different from a normal business, I really like to describe it as this is actually kind of a very similar structure to the structures that people are familiar with. Like a corporation, the board of directors is chosen, but instead of by shareholders in proportion to their investment, it's by members based on one member, one vote, and profits are allocated based on their use of the co-op. And then from the board of directors, there's a staff structure serving the customers who are also members. The thing I want to emphasize is that with a co-op, you can really differentiate between the initial investment to become a member of the co-op and the way you structure goods and services. So I think a lot of people have this idea that if you're going to do it as a co-op with ownership, you're asking people to make a multi-$1,000 upfront investment, which then is, of course, inaccessible for a lot of people. But for example, the way we structure it is that we ask our members to purchase a one-time $25 membership share, which gives them access to voting. So, electing the board, running for the board, whatever. And then based on their share of the purchases in the co-op, they get profit distributions. And most of our subscriptions, about 95%, are structured as no upfront, pay as you go. So a member is getting credit on their utility bill from community solar, and they're paying the co-op on a monthly basis at a lower rate. So they're getting a net savings, usually in the range of 7 to 10%, although we expect that to grow over time, just based on how we've structured our subscription prices. So they get an immediate discount on their utility bill. And then after the co-op has paid off operating expenses, debt service, so on and so forth, as the co-op makes a profit, we then distribute that to our members based on their proportion of the kilowatt hours. So even if a low-income resident has no upfront investment other than a $25 membership share, because they are participating on a monthly basis as a subscriber and paying the co-op for that service, they're effectively building wealth both through cash distributions and also an equity account in the co-op, as the co-op is generating profit from these projects. I'm happy to go into the details of that as much as would be helpful. This is one of our annual members meetings. This was a couple of years ago before several of our projects had come online, just to get a sense of kind of the level of discussion and engagement that we have. This is a celebration we held at that Ramp A Community Solar Garden back in late 2019. I think this was probably our last event before everything shut down, but just people coming together in this case in a very urban setting. And I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of what are the long-term impacts of these types of projects. So in terms of upfront bill savings for a 1 megawatt project, we're generating about $900,000 over 25 years in net utility bill savings. Again, that's spread over roughly 150 households. They don't have any upfront cost. They're just getting that net annual savings. We're generating about $200,000 in lease revenue to a commercial property owner or a rural farmer. For the rooftop projects, this is roughly an 80,000 square foot roof. It has benefits for the roof owner. About 150,000 in net savings to the host business or the host entity. So in many cases, whoever is hosting the site will say, well, I want 10 or 15% of the energy output of that project. And this number is based on a 15% savings. Again, they're getting a lower bill credit rate because of their business status, but we structure the subscription so they still get a net savings. About 800,000 in co-op member dividends. This is the cash and equity distributions to our members. And then job creation. There's a very intensive period of lots of jobs, plus, some operations and maintenance and administration jobs over the long term. The other thing I really want to emphasize is I think people decide to do this, they come into it for non-monetary reasons, whether that's I want to help the environment, or I want to have energy independence. I want to help other people in my community. There's all these values that drive it. And then the financials just allow people to say yes. A lot of people would want to do this anyway, but the fact that it's a savings is really what gets people over the finish line. But what really keeps people engaged is just seeing different people in their community come together around these projects. And you don't get this with a lot of other community solar developments that are much more impersonal, or it's really just a sales relationship. Members being able to come together and meet other people in their community, learn more about how the energy systems works, how utilities work, get connected to community organizations that are helping low-income people in their community, get connected to organizations that are fighting for a clean energy future. This is really what gets people to take their relationship to clean energy beyond just, I pay a bill every month, into I have a stake and I have a say and a sense of this really is not just a service being provided to me, it's a service that we're creating together. And I think that's a really important shift in how people think about the energy system. I just wanted to, this is probably very familiar to anyone who's done solar, but I just wanted to provide a little bit of a teaser in terms of thinking about how you can engage community in the different pieces of developing a project. So obviously first, for any project, you have to secure a site, rooftop, open land, parking canopy, if you can figure that out economically. There's a lot of opportunities to engage communities and saying, where would we like this? Where would we like to see this? And obviously you have to have some parameters around, well, how big do you need it to be in order to be cost effective and some other things like that. But we've found that people really like thinking about, could we put this on our neighborhood grocery store? Could we put this on you know, the public works building in the city? Could we put this on, you know, my neighbor's field, or, you know, whatever it is? We haven't found a lot of good ways to engage the public in the interconnection and program approval process, because as I'm sure you all know, that's very dry and technical. But I think we have gained some credibility, just in terms of our relationship with the utility, because we have so many people who are excited about the project. In terms of selecting and managing installation contractors, obviously thinking about and getting communities to define, you know, what are our priorities? Is our priorities minority hiring? Is it hiring a local business? Is it actually building in apprenticeship and training programs? Having people have a stake and being able to get involved in identifying who's doing the work. Obviously, you have to secure land use and zoning permitting. Public engagement in that is very helpful. You know, when zoning administrators see dozens of people who are like, I want to be a part of this, I want this in my community, it's a very helpful piece to the permitting process. Structuring and securing financing. Again, there's not usually a lot of detailed community engagement in that, but we have found some ways to invite our members to invest in the co-op, like through preferred stock or other mechanisms like that, which help us have the equity that we need as a co-op to take direct ownership of these projects and therefore pass it on to all of our members. Also, having a really robust base of community support creates essentially the evidence for, you know, you have enough subscribers, you have a wait list. If somebody moves out of the area, there'll be somebody to fill it. And we've actually taken an additional strategy, which has been very effective, of designing what we call a backup subscriber. So this is often a municipality, or in some cases a corporation, that is only subscribing for, say, 10 or 15% of the array, but the contract we sign with them allows us to flex their subscription upward, you know, legally all the way up to 40%, but usually in practice it's just a percentage point or two. If there is vacancy by our residential subscribers, which essentially gives our financiers the assurance that even if people drop out or default, there'll be this large institution to take up a large portion of the slack, which has gotten many of our financing partners to, well, all of the ones that we work with, to agree not even to look at credit checks, because there's enough security in the subscriber base as opposed to the individual subscribers. Engaging community members, that's obviously a great place for communities to be actively involved in engaging other people in their community in the project. The technical management, often less involvement, but again, we really have prioritized making sure that our members get to visit the systems. That's been a little slow during COVID, but that's been a big focus of ours, as well as just having access to, you know, the reporting and the monitoring data about production and helping people see that connection. And then obviously we have to, on an ongoing basis, manage subscribers, support our members. People move and we have to help them transfer to their subscriptions to new addresses. People have questions. And again, we found that the more people can have those discussions at a community level as opposed to one-on-one, it feels less scary, less stressful, and more fun.
Around. Couldn't handle it anymore. Betsy was ready to keep going.
Sorry, I think that's just background noise, right? Okay. So I wanted to just highlight in closing the key policy challenge that we're facing, which I think is an important warning for how you think about the program in New Mexico. So I mentioned back in 2017, the rate shifted from the applicable retail rate to the value of solar. That was in some ways anticipated, but the way it happened created, I think, a really negative experience for residents, because it changed from a rate structure where residents were getting compensated quite a bit more about 3 cents per kilowatt hour more than commercial customers, which gave developers an incentive to serve residents. It allowed deeper savings for residents. And then when we switched to valued solar, the compensation rate for the businesses went down about 5 to 10%, but the compensation for residents went down about 35%. And so it made it really hard to serve residential customers. Basically, we put our new development on hold. All of those 8 projects I discussed were prior to the applicable retail rate, until a few years later, we managed to get a residential adder, which was a 1.5 cent boost for residential customers, which was only temporary. And that's allowed us to do a whole nother set of projects. But now we're in discussions about what happens with that. I really wanted to highlight that part of the reason for this shift and a lot of the pressure that the program has come under has been because the utility has really harped on the concern about high program costs that are benefiting primarily commercial customers. The fact that 87% of the capacity in our Solar Garden program is going to businesses, and that for a long time they were getting compensated 2 cents above their retail rate, effectively raised this concern that, hey, all ratepayers, including residents and low-income folks, are paying for this program, but most of the benefit is going to the big businesses. And so I think really looking at how do you structure the rates so that they are sufficient, but that the program is designed in a way that the benefits are concentrated among people who most need protection as opposed to the other way around, is, I think, pretty essential for maintaining policy and political support for community solar. As I mentioned, this change had the effect of making residential subscriptions less viable. It's also made smaller projects less viable. In some of those examples I showed you, we were doing projects all the way down to about 200 kilowatts. Now we're basically doing projects 700 kilowatts and up, which means a lot of those rooftop and community sited locations that we could focus on in the past, it just can't pencil. And we are very actively engaged now in policy efforts, basically to restructure the program, to focus it more on residents, to get better compensation for residents, and really to try and steer the industry back to what we believe was the original intent. So I'm just going to put my contact information up there in case you want to follow up with questions. And that's all that I had. And I'm going to stop sharing and open it up for discussion.
Thank you, Timothy. That was a lot to digest. I just added to the chat particular rules that we have here in New Mexico. And as an update on all of that, we passed the law in the March. It got signed into law. We were all writing desperate letters to the governor because it seemed like it was getting really close to the deadline of fall off the table. And she signed it. And we didn't get everything we wanted. And it is a little skewed. And maybe that's good in the benefit of the independent owned utilities. We call them IOUs, and PNM is the biggest one here in the state. They're only giving away 1% of their load. So it's a very small pilot program. However, entities from, for the most part, Minnesota and the East Coast that are already doing this in a big way around the country have come here and already started queuing up to build their big projects. Now, that's great, but that's the kind of community solar that doesn't have the community in it very much. And I think it's incumbent upon New Mexico Solar Energy Association members, and we have an emissary from the La Montanita Co-op here tonight, Peter Chestnut, who has overseen and grown a business to $35 million, 5 stores since 1976. So we have people with deep co-op experience here in Albuquerque. And I think right now would be a good time for you, if there were any questions you had. I had one, which is who pays for the cost of interconnection? You said that Excel has to connect, but then when there's, who's paying for the extra hardware that might be required for an interconnection?
It's the developer. So in our case, it's us. Whoever is developing the project pays for that interconnection cost.
And so what I was going to mention is that beginning on June 24th, the Public Regulation Commission, our PRC, is beginning a workshop to discuss the rulemaking that takes the 2021 Community Solar Act and turns it into actual rules. And so this is the time to be involved if you want to get involved. And I'll put the email of how to get on that list so you're notified of these meetings, so that we have more than just developers, out-of-state developers, and rural electric co-ops who don't even want to do this, and they don't even have to if they don't want. And then the IOUs, which include XL a little bit in the north, but mostly PNM and El Paso Electric. So please.
Michael, do you have your hand up? I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I see it. Am I able to be heard?
Yep.
Oh, good. All right. Thank you. I have a question about simplification. To what extent do you think that bureaucracy in government is an obstacle to the development of community solar? And another question relating to simplified technology. In other words, we mass produce the most workable designs and we stop making the stuff that's less workable. It seems to me that as we progress into the future, it's going to be more and more important that whatever we make will have durable quality. That's basically my questions.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely some situations, specifically some counties' zoning policies that have been challenging, but I would say that's been a tiny problem in comparison to the obstruction, delays, expense that the utilities have created and the amount of time they spend trying to kill this program at the legislature.
So you're saying the rigmarole that you have to go through is allowing the existing establishment to slow progress?
I mean, definitely slow it as compared to what we would prefer and what would be efficient. We're still, I mean, the industry is still building solar far faster than they would like. And it's, you know, getting to the point where it's starting to compete with their own resource plans. So, you know, yes, they are slowing it down, but they still have to abide by program law. To your second question, I mean, yeah, in principle, we're very much on the same page about durability. This entire program in Minnesota is designed around a 25-year like contract term. And I think in the solar industry, pretty much everyone here kind of thinks on that general time frame. We're very aware that there's lots of solar panels already in use that have been operating. I mean, a small number in comparison to how much we've just built, but there's solar panels operating that have been in place 30 and 40 years. We just have no idea what the utility sector, the economics, or the technology 25 years from now is going to look like. So I don't really know how to answer that question. I feel like 25 years is kind of a current industry standard on durability. I don't know if that should be, you know.
Yeah, I was thinking more about the problems that result from having too many designs in the market and
Sure.
no interchangeable parts among them.
It it is really annoying given that, you know, acquiring panels is always a bit of a hunt, that nearly every time you find a new panel, because that's what's available, you have to, you know, slightly change your racking or other designs. It's just, it's pretty frustrating, but I mean, it's, you know, it's minor annoyances in our experience.
There was one more question about your flat roof installations. Are you using a Fresnelling glazing to get the solar angle correct, or are you using something like high index glass on the surface? Or do you know about that?
I mean, I'm probably not the best person to ask that question. We're generally using pretty off the shelf products, so we're not doing anything special with the panels or the glass on the panels. I'm not the right person to answer what's already included in those products.
So Timothy, I have a question. I'm a structural engineer, and I know that quite a few projects where they wanted to put ballasted panels on churches and, you know, flat roofed buildings have been stopped because of uncertainty about the structural strength of the roof. Has that been a problem in your state?
Yeah, there are definitely some situations in which we run into that. I don't know what the conditions are like in New Mexico, but in Minnesota, all of our buildings are built for, depending on the code, we have 40 to 50 pounds of snow load. And depending on when the building was built, those codes may have actually been more stringent than they are now. So we do occasionally run into situations where a building can't handle it because of structure, but it's maybe 20 or 30% of buildings. It's definitely not a majority. The bigger issue we have is, you know, roof membrane is 10 years into its life and needs to be replaced in 10 years. And it's just not the right time to either put solar on or to replace the roof membrane. So that's, you know, a delay issue as opposed to an ultimate blocker, but.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we have much lighter snow loads here, so it's I think going to be a bigger problem here in New Mexico where our roofs are not quite as strong.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Carrie might be able to speak to that, or Oregon Mountain Solar. Corey.
I think we typically do this, Carrie. I think 20 pounds a square foot is what's a common number. You probably, I'm assuming that's what you go by. The engineering stuff we've done as far as codes go, as long as we stay under the 5 pounds a square foot adder, which most roof ballasts we can stay under that, then code wise, we don't have to do anything. I think engineering wise, we've pretty much gotten away from the active. You've already got an active load design there, and we're basically eliminating that with the solar panels. You can't walk on it hardly anymore. I mean, you can't have a party up there anyway. And so structural engineers I've worked with say, basically we're reducing the active load capability and we're only adding under 5 pounds a square foot up there is the passive load, dead load on it. So in generally, if the roof is already to existing code, then it shouldn't be a problem adding what we're adding.
Andrew, it looks like you have a question.
So are there other co-ops other than Cooperative Energy Futures or any other interesting community-based, community-led organizations like one-offs doing what we're doing?
So in Minnesota, we are the only cooperatively owned community solar developer, but there are a few other groups that are doing kind of similar community-based things. There's a nonprofit called Minneapolis Community Action that is specifically kind of managing and recruiting subscribers to some smaller rooftop community solar projects in Minneapolis, working so far primarily in partnership with a development company called Renewable Energy Partners, which is a minority-owned Minneapolis solar developer. And they're doing projects, you know, primarily in low-income communities of color. there's a organization in northern Minnesota called Rural Renewable Energy Alliance that in rural Minnesota, there's a lot of co-op projects, like rural electric co-op projects that are called community solar, but they're like 40 kilowatts and you have to pay like $3,000 up front to be a part of it. So it's like a very different thing. But Rural Renewable Energy Alliance has used some of those programs and then also done some kind of creative net metered programs where the benefit, the cash savings goes to community action agencies to basically provide a community action benefit to energy assistance recipients. There's some, again, very small, like 40 kilowatt rooftop community solar work in Duluth, which is in another investor-owned utility Minnesota Power territory that an organization called Equilibrium 3 is working on. So there's some of these other models, but in Minnesota, we are, I'd say definitely the largest low income and community focused organization doing this, and the only one that's using a cooperative structure. We are in partnership with other co-op and co-op-like projects around the country. So there is a organization that we and other clean energy co-ops have formed together called the People's Solar Energy Fund that is providing coordinated financing and technical assistance for cooperative and community-owned projects all around the country.
And Lynn Benander is part of that?
Yep. Yeah, Lynn Benander with Co-op Power, which is a very similar co-op working in Massachusetts and New York, is a part of that.
And then
I think Andrew just put in a link to the People Power Solar Co-op bylaws, which is doing similar work in California and the Bay Area. There's a number of local chapters of NAACP, the Climate Justice Alliance, Emerald Cities, a number of tribal groups working with the Indigenous Environmental Network. There's a total of about 25 organizations that are doing this kind of work as part of the People's Solar Energy Fund around the country. And some of those organizations are like platforms with many different local chapters. So there's a lot of interest in this general model as a way to build community wealth and create benefit. And again, if there are organizations in New Mexico that want to try and do this, that People's Solar Energy Fund would be a great place to direct them for membership and obviously the technical support and financing support.
Now I'm trying to remember what the crowdsourcing outfit. I met them also through the NREL's National Community Solar Partnership. I'm trying to.
Oh, you're talking about Revolve?
Okay, well, there might be several of them, but
yeah, there's a few.
And that's just maybe people that could find for you the tax equity partners for your project or something.
Yeah, we have not found much success in getting kind of a crowdfunding strategy for tax equity, because tax equity, it's a very complex tax structure. You have to have the right kind of passive income, and you have to be willing to do a whole bunch of legal and accounting work if you haven't already figured this out. So we have tried to use, we've coordinated with family offices and like social impact investment funds to secure local tax equity. That's really never come through for us. So we've pretty much had to rely on large private equity for the tax equity side of the project. We have had success working with local banks as well as with, I mentioned we've done cooperative preferred stock for our co-ops portion of the equity. So there are ways to involve community investment, but at least in our model, like the direct community investment has been, 8 to 10% of the overall financing stack, which still it enables us to have community ownership. So it's an incredibly important part. But we've financed 7 megawatts of projects, about $16.5 million, and we're doing a little bit more than that in our second round. So it's a lot of money to crowdfund.
Right.
I have a question. I'm new to this, but you just mentioned working with banks.
Mhm.
Have you had more or less success working with credit unions or commercial banks?
We have not so far had success with credit unions. I think there is interest, but I think that their lending models, there's some kind of credit union regulation that I don't fully know all the details of that directs credit unions primarily towards individual as opposed to business lending. It's not absolute, but it tends to be easier for them, and that's often where credit unions have put their focus. I just think, and we found this too, Minnesota is probably now ahead of the game, but when we were doing a lot of this 4 or 5 years ago with our first round of projects, none of the bankers and local banks in Minnesota knew anything about how to finance solar, and it was very mystifying for them. And so we initially started working with local and regional banks in other states that had a robust solar market. And now we're starting to work more actually with lenders in Iowa and other parts of the Midwest. But the tax equity market is still very national and very centralized, which is always the hard part.
Thank you.
Well, there's certainly probably a perfect size scale. I think if we're careful and can get the PRC to want to see a lot of distributed opportunities for smaller groups, it would, of course, it'd be great if like La Montanita Co-op decides this is the next new thing. We absolutely, food is important, but energy, food and water are all tied together. So Peter retiring, don't you think this would be a great new venture for us? Really, Peter has selflessly donated his time overseeing a Montanita Co-op for so many years. We can't even count them, but we could try 44, 45 years maybe. So, and then the New Mexico Solar Energy Association, maybe this would be a great thing to, pilot. Because if we don't, business as usual will be business as usual forever, and there will not be an energy transition that is just or fair. So anyway, we've been on for an hour. How's everybody feel? More questions, or do we let Timothy go? It's 8:30 there.
I think Michael has his hand up.
Okay, good, Mike.
Yeah, just one more question. Well, not so much a question, it's a statement, because I remember seeing a news article about a solar tile that's so tough. The French are making roads with it, and they're, you can drive cars. So I found that hard to believe, but if it's true, it would allow making a rooftop that you can dance on if you want to. What do you think of that idea? Am I being heard?
They've built a mile of that roadway.
Pardon me?
They've built that roadway in Sweden or Norway to try. But it turns out that it's probably better to have your solar cells sitting in one place and just charge your battery. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about it. That sounds like an interesting novelty in terms of solar capture. Demonstrates the durability of solar. If they think that much of it, that they would build a roadway out of it, but I just wonder if it's real or not. I haven't really seen it myself, and there's fake news on the internet. So,
It may have an applicability for electric trains that already have right of way. So they have, and ultimately if they already have a mechanism for picking up electricity, the third rail, then you already have sort of the infrastructure for that.
I think they're planning on something like that in Spain. That was my understanding. Anyways, I do have one question, but I think Carrie has one as well.
Okay, quick. Do you, Timothy, or maybe Andrew, do you have to have anchor tenants to really make these work? Is that part of the thing that makes them happen?
So okay. Usually when somebody is saying anchor tenant, they're thinking about like one large entity that's using 40%
Right.
of the array.
Yeah.
I think that's a typical way these programs were started, but I think it's becoming less and less how it's done. And I think the financial sector is not expecting that as much. We don't use anchor tenants. We do use what we, as I mentioned earlier, the backup subscriber, which allows us to scale them up to 40%. But on an average day, they're only using, say, 10 to 12%.
But you kind of need that to make this, it's kind of risky without that.
I would say it is perceived as risky. The financial sector is, very hand wavy about, well, what if all of your subscribers drop out? And, there's only so much that us saying, well, if our subscribers don't pay us, we remove their subscription and then they owe a utility bill that is higher than what they would have paid us. And if they don't pay their utility bill, their lights get cut off. So like, I think a lot of the risk is the financial sector feeling like something is really risky when this is really not much more risky than people paying their utility bills.
So not a
It is a
requirement.
new,
As we look for applications, it's not a requirement really to do that.
yeah, I mean, I think definitely the policy structure should allow that because it can be a useful tool in financing, but it's not the only way to do it.
Okay, great, thanks.
My last question is what size system seems to work best for financing, etc. There must be a sweet spot.
Yeah. What I've found is that the financiers, obviously your cost per watt matters a lot, but once you've got your cost per watt low, it matters less your project size and more your portfolio size. So we've never financed our projects as one-offs. We've financed, 7 projects in one package. And so each of those projects, I mean, in the first round, we went as low as 200 kilowatts and, as large as 1.3 megawatts, but we financed 6.8 megawatts altogether. And I think it's pretty difficult to finance a portfolio of projects smaller than 5 megawatts. But that doesn't mean the project has to be 5 megawatts. It could be 5 1 megawatt projects or, whatever. Obviously, if you get above a megawatt, you have a little bit of an economy of scale going up to 2 or 3. But we've found that the cost reduction is not that huge going larger. And also you start to, in some cases, run into much more expensive interconnection costs. So we like the megawatt scale. For a while in Minnesota, they were allowing co-location up to 5 megawatts, but now in Minnesota, they only allow up to 1 megawatt. So we don't do anything larger than that. Sorry, that's AC system size. So we'll often be developing, 1.3 or 1.4 megawatt DC, 1 megawatt AC, or slightly smaller if there's a constraint for roof size or in some cases interconnection capacity. I think like there has been very much an industry trend towards bigger is better. And like, yes, there are some economies of scale, but the economies of scale diminish the bigger you get. And you start to run into grid constraints and other things that make it more expensive when you go big. Yeah. So like you want it to be big enough to make it cheap, but not so big that you're trying to pump a lot of energy into somewhere where there's no use for it.
And even further of that, you don't want to be the pig hogging off the capacity of the distribution line.
Right.
All of our local installers can't even hook up the residential homes that just want to do one-offs.
Yep.
Yeah.
There's a balance there too as well. Plus, at 4 to 6 acres a megawatt, you really want that in your urban setting? I mean, sure, for the brownfields, for the old landfills, that's fantastic. But there's got to be, there's also land use planning that's critical in all of this. That
Yeah, and again, in the urban areas, we've never done a ground mount in an urban area because there's just no space for it. Like all of those projects were using, 70, 80, 100,000 square foot roofs.
Timothy, do you think that, have you run into pressure from people who think it's okay if Minnesota generates the energy and sends it to some other state?
I mean, there's a lot of that in kind of the like climate and clean energy industry as a whole. It's not really a thing with community solar specifically because the community solar garden program is very state specific. But yeah, I mean, I think there has been an addiction to the idea that we make the energy transition by making everything giant and sending it hundreds or thousands of miles, and like no thought to how expensive all of that transmission and distribution infrastructure is. And I feel like the fact that a lot of climate and environmental organizations have fed into that has enabled the utilities to really go after this argument of bigger is better. The utilities ought to own all of the clean energy we develop, even though, I mean, I don't know if you all have seen that article that just came out from Dave Roberts that's looking at the vibrant clean energy analysis. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about? I'll post this in the chat, but it's a phenomenal article, and it's summarizing some really in-depth research that Vibrant Clean Energy did, which is essentially identifying that having a large volume of distributed energy, whether that's on rooftops or at the community scale, sized for load of local communities, is actually dramatically cheaper and requires a lot less, backup power plants, transmission capacity, all of the stuff that is dirty, expensive, and the utilities want to make money on. So it was really good analysis, and I think we're in the very early stages of starting to shift the narrative, and we're going through a integrated resource planning process in Minnesota right now with Xcel, which is again our largest utility. They're about 55% of the customer base in the state. And it's really the first time that a lot of the environmental groups are like digging into the data on how a distributed approach to clean energy just make things a lot better and cheaper. And we've had analysis come out that basically says, Xcel did a baseline for distributed energy. We need to quadruple that. We need to not build any new gas. We need to start shutting down existing gas. And that plan will save Minnesota ratepayers $1 billion per year. And just like the numbers are amazing. And like, if you're thinking that way already about, what's an efficient way to build an energy system, it's kind of intuitive, but actually starting to have the numbers and the analysis about what that looks like and being able to make that case, with data is something that we've never really had before.
I have a question, Timothy. On a sort of cloudy day in Minnesota,
Sure.
are these panels still generating much power, or what percentage of power are they generating?
Yeah, it really depends on how cloudy it is. We have a lot of days in the summer where it's just kind of like patchy clouds. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen like a picture of the Midwest with like these big puffy clouds just sort of like drifting across a blue sky. We have a lot of that, so it's just kind of on and off. We also have periods, especially in the spring and sometimes kind of shoulder seasons of the winter, where it's just really cloudy for multiple days. But again, we're really looking at this as an annual investment. We have to deal with a lot of day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month variability. But the annual averages are still pretty good.
I see.
You know, Timothy, on typically when it's very cloudy, the wind is blowing. And if you could combine solar and wind, you'd have more reliable energy.
Yep. Yeah. And again, like in some cases, that's actually in one system or that's just distributed throughout the network. We would love to be getting into community wind, but we don't currently have a policy in Minnesota that allows us to do it.
Is Minnesota really windy?
Oh,
as a
yes.
rule?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's data out there that says if we fully developed Minnesota's economic wind resource, it could power 31% of the entire country.
Wow.
Yeah, it's real windy here.
But you probably shouldn't do that, though.
Oh, no, exactly. For all the reasons we just talked about.
Yeah. Yeah. We've seen studies that suggest that New Mexico could power a lot of the country with solar.
Yeah.
I was on a Zoom call with the Minnesota utilities a few months back, and they were presenting the idea that it was simply cheaper to overbuild solar to meet the winter need than it was to invest in batteries.
Yeah.
So now that curtailed energy from the summer will be making green hydrogen because you have 10,000 lakes, so no shortage of water. And so Minnesota could be the new Saudi Arabia of the Americas.
Oh, boy. Gotta wonder.
Great.
Well, Timothy, thank you very much for your time. I think this has been really good, and you got to talk to some smart people here in New Mexico who I hope their brains are afire about how they're talk to you and the folks over at People's Solar Energy Fund and how we're going to join you guys and try to be helpful in this transition to make it equitable and just for everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And I'm really excited that you all are starting on this adventure and would love to be in touch and provide those connections as makes sense.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay.